let's move on to industry news. I think the biggest, a massive headline last week and into this week was Sha'Carri and the Olympics and the ban for cannabis consumption. These types of headlines are so devastating. When you see all this progress happening in the industry and all this good stuff that we talk about, and this happens. It's just brutal. And I wrote recently when the NFL made the investment to study cannabis and their players and the efficacy. They made a very tiny investment, but at least they acknowledged it. And I was reading about the World Anti-Doping Agency, and back in 2018 they actually removed CBD from their list of banned substances, and they do allow athletes to have THC in their system when they're doing random out of competition drug tests. So it means athletes can consume, but they do have it as a prohibited substance for post race or in competition drug tests, and I guess this might fall under that. But just signals like we really need to see some change here. I think the only silver lining, if there's any silver lining, is it's going to force a conversation. I mean, this was fastest person in America going out to the Olympics and now can't represent this country. And hopefully people in America realize like that this is bad for us, that we should have let her go, and the doping anti-doping agency should really reevaluate this stuff. And I know, Emily, you're really close to Athletes for Care. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a mission that's very similar here, changing perceptions and so on. So, given that you're so close to, Athletes for Care for so long now at this point, how do you see, this whole thing?
Yeah, so just for everybody, Athletes for Care is an organization with athletes, professional athletes who have come together because they feel as though, as our heroes, just like it's very interesting because we have the veteran community, which I think gets, has not been granted enough access to cannabis. I think Canada did a much better job with that. We have our veterans, we have our war heroes, and we have our athletes. And these are the people who we hold up in our society as the people who, we really respect. They're the champions of our lives. We get to watch them perform, but it's at great cost to their bodies. And there's a lot that goes on with athletes where they get pumped full of opiates, they get pushed back out onto the field, they have injuries that can impact their lifespan, the quality of their life, their relationships, like such as the head injuries. And Athletes for Care is very much about focusing on how do we do a better job of caring for our athletes, and especially like how do we do that through the entire professional process, but then how do we do it on the backside as well? How do we make sure that when someone's served a very successful but yet mainly potentially very painful career, how do they come out and have the support that they deserve? And so I got involved a couple years ago, and it was one of the most incredible things to meet the athletes and to meet the athletes' families and to hear about how cannabis has changed their lives, because they were, pumped full of opiates, and that changes people's personalities. It can make them very aggressive or very unhappy or disconnected. And I met some of the wives of some of these athletes, because at the time it was predominantly male athletes that I was meeting, but we do have a lot of female athletes in the organization as well. They couldn't say enough about how this changed their entire family and basically saved their relationships and saved their partners who were competing at these tremendous levels. So Athletes for Care, obviously, I thought about this when I saw what happened to Sha'Carri. I mean, I just have to say, too, in our society, the way that we have these different role models or the people that we hold up on a pedestal, she is somebody that I was so excited to see running in this year's Olympics. I did run track. I used to run relays. And so I was just so excited for this event this year, especially coming out of the pandemic, thinking about how these athletes' dreams had been delayed because of the pandemic, and they had to go through, because you go through so much emotionally, mentally, and physically to train for this. And so knowing that they had to kind of delay that for a year, put their lives into that space where they're continuing to push to these dreams. And she's just the fastest and so fun to watch. And so I just felt like we've taken someone who could have been a great role model for especially young women everywhere. To see this woman who's really, clearly she has family issues. That's how this all happened, as a reporter basically blew up this story about right in front of her. She had no idea that her biological mother had passed away, and a reporter asked her about it in an interview. And obviously that just kind of like threw her off her center. Sure. I mean, how could you not? Even if, no matter what your relationship is with your biological mother, if it's good or bad or complicated at the very least, that's going to surprise you. And the way we think about how people cope with things, she was in a legal state, and so she consumed cannabis. She didn't go out on a drinking bender. She didn't pop a lot of pills. She didn't do a lot of things that a lot of people who maybe of weaker character might have approached, how they may have approached this. She took a very responsible approach. But the rules are the rules, which is what everybody keeps saying. And my argument on this is that the rules are outdated and unprogressive, right, and unthoughtful. And so I think that, we at Athletes for Care, there's a lot of raising of awareness around how cannabis is a productive and positive impact on athletes' lives, for everything from post-training to mental emotional relaxation, all of these different things. I mean, it's a really important thing. And so we are really, as an organization, leaning in on supporting this and supporting athletes around this. And I do think we've seen some change in the leagues, but this is definitely a gap in progress for sure.
Yeah, and it's a great point. I mean, rules can be changed, and I think in this example, it's extremely clear that it does need to be changed and not treated as a performance-enhancing drug in the same way, especially when we're regulating it like things like alcohol. It's just untenable, and hopefully this forces the conversation and makes people really look at it pretty closely, and maybe we'll see some change. I'm certain that she'll be on the right side of history of this one, and will always be like that story of like, here's another prohibition story. Here's another situation where prohibition caused so many problems and is just was a crazy position to be in. And in hindsight, we'll look back and just think about how strange that this happened. And it's very unfortunate for her. I can't imagine, this is her career. This is what she does so well, and not being able to do it at the level that she's earned. It's pretty disappointing. Other news around this, there was a recent poll, YouGov, who's done some polling work in cannabis before that we've talked about. They surveyed 30,000 Americans about the decision, and they found that a majority of women actually opposed the suspension versus supported it, and it's actually flipped for men. But this is notable because when you look at most cannabis polls and even cannabis sales, it's basically 2-to-1 male to female ratio. So 2/3 of sales go to males in legal cannabis markets. But you're seeing here, women opposing the suspension, which, hopefully will start to get those numbers up on supporting of legalization and ending of prohibition, right? Because they see kind of the disconnect here. So that's, kind of interesting, I think, and worth noting, and hopefully it continues to move the needle for more adoption. I mean, we are in a majority of Americans that, believe cannabis should be, legalized and decriminalized and so on. But when you look at the male-female split, it's females usually a little less than male audiences. And again, that could be reflected in how people are purchasing it. But, situations like this may force some perception changes there as well. And then, further progress towards legalization. So only silver lining I can find in this whole situation.
Yeah, I would say there's one other thing that I thought was a good... I know, and it's like all at the cost of her getting to go to the Olympics. So sad. I can't handle it. But one of the through lines of things we've been talking about in the podcast is how private industry or companies are the ones who are really taking the right steps or the more progressive steps on this industry versus the government. The government's lagging behind. It's not following what the constituents of the people who are sitting in those seats want. But you're seeing, we saw Amazon make a step forward, and now we're seeing that Nike really stood up behind her. They didn't go crazy with it, but they said, we support her, and they're going to continue to work with her in a sponsorship role. And I feel like that's a really important piece of being behind her on this from Nike. Nike is one of the biggest brands around fitness and athleticism in the world, or maybe the largest. And the fact that they said we support her and they respected the way she managed through this, I feel like is a big sign. And so I'm curious to see if Nike starts to take a different step on this. But again, it's just like, here's that big gap between government and industry and how we're supporting this new market. So.
Yeah, great point. And Nike's in Oregon there, right? In Beaverton, I believe. And so, legal state, been legal for a long time, very progressive state. But it's good to see that they're going to continue to support her. Well, we'll see how this changes things. But yeah, hopefully only for the better.
Listen to High Rise on all major streaming platforms and watch the visual on YouTube.